right, I'll get started. You all can hear me fine, right? Having some mic issues, but we'll soldier through. So hello, if you don't know me, I'm Justin Parsher from Knowlton School's Landscape section, and today I'm very happy to welcome Anya Domlesky to our icy realm of Columbus, Ohio. Domlesky is an associate principal and the director of research at SWA, where she heads up the firm's XL Lab. XL Lab officially launched at SWA in 2016 and is a leader in a wave of dedicated research initiatives hatched within existing firms. And the special context of SWA has helped them succeed in the XL Lab, being a firm that's large and established enough to carry it, but not so giant or corporate that it suppresses the innovation that they're engaged in. And Domlesky has written recently about how the relatively flat structure of the firm, with only 3 levels of hierarchy per office pod, discourages top-down directives and encourages emergent innovation. So throughout its history, the XL Lab has focused on 3 main themes: climate change, emerging technologies, and processes of urbanization. And given how those themes tend to stretch far beyond the scale of your conventional site design, a key part of the lab's mission is really to reach past reactive, client-driven work and strategize for ways that landscape architecture can meaningfully address unprecedented challenges. That this is happening under the umbrella of a professional firm is in part a critique of how research has traditionally been put into practice in our field. And Domlesky has written about the, quote, paucity of tools, actionable information, and practice-relevant research outputs from the academy for application in the real world at scale, and the inertia of practice and risk-averse clients towards business as usual unless evidence for other courses of action is demonstrated. So this is a big part of what the XL Lab is meant to make up the shortcomings of. At times, XL Lab works as an in-house resource to learn from and improve the built work that the firm's doing. They've got access to the large back catalog of SWA, and in the wake of a 2016 merger, the Thomas Balsley Associates. XL Lab has been able to carry out key work in post-occupancy evaluation. Having studied Buffalo Bayou Park in Houston, Hunters Point South Riverfront Park in New York, in partnership with the LAF and researchers at Penn State and UT Arlington. They've also used AI tools to revisit the findings of William White for the present day and have analyzed the performance of built plazas with some intriguing results that speak to the ways that digital connectivity has changed how people use public space. They've also developed resources for the firm and for others beyond the firm, digital materials database, a climate infrastructure toolkit, to ensure climate value for projects where it's not always feasible to pursue formal LEED or site certification. Their expertise in developing tools for practice extends beyond into publicly available resources, and especially in light of the recent wildfires in LA, I would urge you especially to check out their recent pamphlet, Playbook for the Pyrocene: Design Strategies for Fire, which is freely available online. They've also worked in speculative design with the Urban Sensorium and Mega Margin projects, imagining urban futures. And as part of their ongoing project, Middleweights, Metros at the Vanguard of American Urbanism, they've even analyzed Columbus as one example of a mid-sized urban region in the U.S. with a strong economy that can probably look forward to challenges in its public realm as it continues to grow. So that list of projects hopefully tells you something about the range of what Domlesky and her team have tackled in the past 8+ years. And in addition to all of that, I can also tell you Domlesky is a fabulous critic, and I highly recommend. She has a great takedown of the Countryside exhibition from a few years ago in JOLA in 2020. Check it out, it's a beauty. She'll be speaking today on Public Works Infrastructure Rescripted for Life. So please join me in welcoming Anya Domlesky.
And I will go, as a kind of quick overview, through about 5 more that share some attributes in that they study real-world sites. I have to say, you'll see that I'm a big advocate for sort of not being too precious about disciplinary boundaries. I was educated first as an architect, worked as a planner in New York City, and then found my home in landscape architecture. And I think, so you'll see some of that sort of blending throughout the projects. I do think that each of those disciplines have strengths where others are weak, and so I think there's some things that you can learn from all of those. What about now? Better? Yes?
Project a little more.
Project! Okay. Okay. So, all right. Justin gave a little bit of a background, but basically in our firm, we are sort of big enough, and there's these initiatives that crop up every so often. We have the fellowship program, which gives dedicated time and money to staff members to pursue their own projects. They're selectively or competitively selected every year. We have the summer intern program that tackles a certain issue, and all these initiatives that would kind of live and die and sort of go into the ether. In 2016, we sort of consolidated this as Excel Lab, the Research and Innovation Lab at SWA, as kind of a home for some of that disciplinary knowledge and initiatives. And this was a proposal between myself and 2 colleagues in the Northern California office in Sausalito. And we really deal with these kind of 3 subjects. So climate change, this can be on the carbon side and on the adaptation side. Emerging technologies, especially in the built environment or how they affect the built environment, and urbanization or reurbanization or depopulation, wherever you are in the world. This is the kind of group, so the structure is myself and a colleague of mine full-time, along with 3 principals as kind of the leadership committee, and then 1 to 3 Excel members in each office. So we have 8 offices, 7 in the US, 1 in China, and this helps represent and feed back into our work and let us know what the office's concerns are. They're all quite different and unique, different sizes, different types of work. And so in addition to the Excel members, we really do these kind of workshops, I would say every 3 or so years with each office to understand what types of projects people want to work on, what their roadblocks are, how they think research can influence what they're doing in practice. And so our audience, as you might imagine, is very centrally designed teams. That's kind of the obvious one, but we actually have effects on the rest of the business. One is to build expertise for new types of work. This is often something that research can do much faster than going after work that it might be very niche. This is kind of what we pursue with our climate work. It's not something clients are really demanding yet in volume, although it's becoming more common. So it's a way to sort of lead with the expertise that where you want to go, and then more public-facing outputs for partners. Within the firm and in the discipline in general, people get very hung up about the definition of research and design. And this is the definition for us. This works for us. It's very simple. It just means systematic inquiry directed towards the creation of knowledge. So that just means that unlike a design project, which you might argue is systematic, it is not aiming towards a particular goal, and it's not distributed. And related to that, it's also called a bunch of different things. I prefer practice-based research, also call it innovation foresight, but I don't prefer the ones sort of below the bar. I think they aren't exactly what we do. They sometimes muddy the waters a little bit. And to clarify how we work in 3 main methods and kind of 1 mixed method. So 4 types. That's foresight. This is basically a process where we are looking to the future. We're getting signals. We're getting drivers of change. We're trying to understand the future environment with things that we can see now. Research is what you might think of as, the scientific method, analytical. You're looking at something that exists. You're extrapolating from it. Visualization and simulation is more of a kind of sandbox. This is where we test new technologies or new tools to see if we can adapt or adopt them into our practice. And advocacy, this is also sort of somewhat topical and has a bunch of different methodologies. So this is kind of what keeps us honest and helps us talk about what we do. If you want to learn more about any of these projects that I have talked about, there's, brief synopses on our website and also the outputs. So we make everything public. We don't have anything that's proprietary. That's sort of a founding tenet of the lab. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few projects in very brief overview. And I'm going to talk about ones that use, we're going to start with one that has 1 site, and we're going to end with a project that has 400. So it's a way of looking at projects in the real world or sites in the real world that tell us something. So this first one is a project that the Dallas office did in downtown. This used to be a surface parking lot. It is called Pacific Plaza. This study that we did, this was after the project was built, and it was just to simply look at carbon. Pathfinder was a new tool that Pamela Conrad had just developed and released, sort of the 1.0 version of, and we wanted to know, okay, we didn't design it with carbon in mind, but how does it perform? Not great. So it's 27 years until it is climate positive or carbon negative. And that's okay. We're 7 years off the mark of what would be typical for a project of this type. But we can do a lot better, and we learned that paving is a place that we can improve. And here you can say, well, there's actually not that much paving, which is somewhat true. But it has to do with also how much lawn there is here. That is a surface material that is not, as you might imagine, carbon positive. It's actually a drag on your numbers. So this was just an experiment with the tool to understand sort of one of our projects. This next project takes 2 of our projects, one in New York City and one in Houston, to understand how hurricanes affected these parks. But really the research question here was, is it right to have parks that are floodable? Is it a positive strategy? And what can you learn from these 2 hurricanes? So one was Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Harvey. The New York project was inundated when it was under construction. And the Houston project was inundated many, many years after it had been built. And we learned some really interesting things about each project, but we came up with basically a kind of short list of things to design for if you are in a floodable area. And you can read that in the journal article here. Okay, so that's 2 projects that we kind of synthesized. This is our wildfire work. I say that the eventual product is the playbook for the pyrocene that was mentioned earlier, but we had a lot of projects that kind of led to that. And I would say this whole body of work is about synthesizing what the firm has already done in Southern California and in Northern California. In the past, for instance, we were on the very, very early side of experimenting with how flammable plant material was in Southern California and designing for irrigated buffers. We took all that information from our past projects as well as ones that were in development and synthesized it with some students from University of Michigan into this playbook. And it's essentially filling the gap between the guidance, the design guidance that we have at the parcel level. So if you imagine a homeowner, this idea of defensible space, you want to protect your home just on your 1 acre, half acre, whatever it is, and the scale of the forest. So there's a lot of space, scale-wise, in between those 2. And so this tries to fill the gap, essentially providing a starting place for urban design in the wildland-urban interface. Unfortunately, this has become all too relevant in the past few weeks, and I think this will become a starting place for a lot of projects in LA. Okay, so this project takes 10 sites in New York City. This was a project that we started in 2016, and it has a very basic question. How do people behave in public space? And shockingly, there have not been a lot of people that have studied this since the 1980s in a spatial way, which is wild. So we wanted to have some answers. There's been a lot of types of public space that have come online that are very atypical. We're not talking about Central Park. We're not talking about the Seagram Plaza. We're talking about places that are weird, like this. This is a street that's been half converted to a plaza, so it's a sort of tactical space. It's mostly consisting of furniture and public art that's meant to be pulled up every winter. So we took these 10 sites, and along with traditional observation, we used a machine learning algorithm to do counts and to develop heat maps. And we basically merged these two methods, so the kind of AI method and the traditional observational method, to create 25 takeaways. So how do people use public space now? Super interesting, and informs a lot of our design work in small public spaces, although not every space is New York. We replicated this study with different digital tools in Dallas, so 10 sites in Dallas, very different downtown, and also in San Francisco. So that's about 30 sites for this whole project. Now we're scaling up to, let's say, 30-ish sites. This is our project, that Climate Infrastructure Toolkit, and what it actually did let's see, the methodology was backwards, where we came up with a framework first, and this was a way that we could, you could say, exhaust all possibilities on projects. So clients would come to our design teams and say, like, yeah, we really want a bioswale. We really want some green infrastructure. And you're like, great, that's great. Have you thought about carbon? Have you thought about reuse? Have you thought about materials? And so we could bring a lot of things to the table if we had kind of the full suite. And we just found that what we had been doing in the past was partial. And so we wanted to basically increase our capacity for climate action for clients who were willing or unwilling, but to essentially exhaust all our options. And this includes concepts that are emerging now around social resilience and building that into your built environments. So you saw the framework there. That's kind of a big overview. We developed this into cards, so more of an interactive tool that we could use with our client teams, but also as an engagement tool. We also built an online resource so that you could go directly from the strategy to a resource that would help you do it. And then we're developing an app now that basically takes you through a workflow for any type of project and gives you the output of strategies that are applicable to that. So, and I said this was a kind of backwards project. This then illustrated the concepts or the strategies with projects. So people are able to see exactly, let's say, how you maximize planting area, what that looks like, how you increase evaporative transportation, how you design for nighttime use, for instance. Okay. I'll buzz over this one, but this one has the biggest data set. This is a project that's in development, and it's basically to take some really big data sets that are global for cities and extract their existing tree information. This is a street in Shanghai that's near our office. A recent storm took down the London plane trees. And as an exercise or an illustration of how this tool would work, a landscape architect would have the choice of what to replace it with. What species do you replace it with? Oh, sure, you could say a London plane tree should replace a London plane tree. But as we can see in, for instance, Paris here, which has some of the biggest predicted climate shifts, it's going to start looking very different in terms of its vegetation. Linen plane trees might not be able to survive any longer in Paris in terms of what we're actually specifying today. So this tool will enable designers to look at any city and get a planting list that takes into account projected climate scenarios. Okay, little breather. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is kind of a deeper dive into one of our projects, which is probably our oldest project. It's on infrastructure adaptation. And it's specifically related to 4 transportation infrastructure types. And this project is very much about urban design, taking a long view of urban processes. This is a picture from the 70s of an old SWA project. This, if you've ever been to the Bay Area, this is in the East Bay, underneath the BART tracks. BART is the elevated transit system, a little bit busted today. But essentially this was a HUD grant that the firm got to experiment with these landscapes or public spaces that would be underneath transportation. This was a totally new idea at the time. This is a bigger view of that system. And you can kind of see the green peeping out on the left there. And so, today we work on a lot of these types of projects, not just with rail or elevated rail, but in ports. This is in New York, in river systems, and in road systems. And so this was a really, I would say it's a dominant project type for the firm, but it's very much scales that we work at, that we tend to work at. And it's something that is more common. I should mention here that there are, I would say, the reason for this project is not only that, this is a great project. I think it's a really cool project type. I think it's a really interesting one. But the linear parts of this, or the linear attributes of this type of project actually have a lot of impacts. So if you think of, let's say, Central Park, it's a big space, takes a long time to get to the center, it has advantages because of that, but it doesn't touch a lot of people. And these long, skinny places, if you think of, this is the kind of mental map I'm trying to build, this touches a lot of different people, a lot of different communities, and actually operates as a transportation corridor in itself. It also tends to be located in urban centers. It also sometimes takes advantage of engineering money, and often it is not as contaminated as, let's say, post-industrial sites. If you think of, let's say, Gasworks Park in Seattle, there's a lot less, not that there aren't issues, but there are a lot less contaminants here. Okay. So I mentioned these 4 types. You're seeing on the screen Toronto, Chicago, Detroit, and Toronto again. And this sort of order is roughly historical in terms of how we've developed our own transportation in the US. A few years ago, we mapped this with some the best data available, which is historical data talking about just modal share, we would call it today. You can see port. It used to be, at the beginning of the data set, quite dominant, briefly lost out to river or canal projects, and then rail became hugely, much cheaper, much more efficient, much faster. And then, as we know, road is our dominant transportation type today. So these have all been eventually superseded. So it's not that ports are obsolescent or they're obsolescing now. They've just transformed, and therefore their land use and their spatial footprint is very different. So if we zoom out and look at the full network, you can kind of see this roughly linear aspect. This is Seattle viewed from the northwest. This is Nashville, and all the land area that the components of river infrastructure take up. This is Denver, Colorado, and the rail system there. And Raleigh, North Carolina. And I illustrate these and further examples in cities that are basically growing. So all of these cities have either really explosive urban growth, as in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm not talking about population. We've centered it firmly on economic data, so we're talking about GDP in the MSA, so the Metropolitan Statistical Area. So it's just a fancy way of saying these are the places that or the data says that these will be growing. Okay, so if we zoom in a little bit more, these are sort of synthetic drawings that take all the components of here port infrastructure and take a look at what that looks like. So it starts to look less linear, but these are all made up of the kind of burrs and spurs. So you have the corridor, let's say conceptually, you have this straight line, and then you have spurs, which are essentially the kind of storage areas. So whether that's these stockpiles or bulk terminals or aggregate, and then burrs, which are kind of these nodes within that. So you might think of like a tram station or something like that. So something that's more concentrated on speed, and something that's about more of a parcel. And these are common conceptually across these infrastructure types. And then we just did an inventory of all the components that might make up this system. So this is for road infrastructure, looking at both those corridor types and widths, but also those spurs and burrs. And this is, by the way, what made up those big scale maps. So we just took all the land area in GIS that were attached to these components, and that's how we got those maps. Okay. So, but not all cities are the same. We've been talking kind of in the abstract, these kind of synthetic pictures, components, these are detached from place. Most cities have a dominant infrastructure. They might be hidden, it might be sort of more of a palimpsest where you have different infrastructures overlaying that. But we find as we sort of look at these cities, these growth cities or surge cities, that often the population growth coincides with the build out of that dominant infrastructure. So in Seattle, the spike you see here is a kind of population peak or boom after timber became very important economically. Nashville, less pronounced here, a little bit more subtle. I would say that this probably, if we continue this, would start going up very steeply. It's experiencing a boom today. Denver looks a little bit more like Seattle when it was linked to the first transcontinental railroad. You had a population boom after that. And I should mention also Columbus experienced a boom after the Ohio and Erie Canal had a feeder that came up to Columbus as well. So you have this relationship between population growth and infrastructure, whether it's population first and then infrastructure, population. But often we see on the ground today that these really create the footprint. So these are very durable kinds of patterns. And you can see, like we did a sort of east to west of that, starting with Port in Philly, River, Pittsburgh, Rail, Kansas City, and Road in Vegas. Another view of the same concept is just looking at here the shipping lanes mapped onto those port cities, river cities here. You'll see some overlap with the way we've sort of classified these, rail cities and road cities. And another way to sort of look at this this footprint is through looking at how we would maybe traditionally look, or an architect would look at something like a NOLI plan, right? A black and white understanding of where the voids and where the spaces are. So here you're seeing building footprints of each city, And then an overlay of that shipping traffic and shoreline. Here, the footprints again, and the rivers. I think rail is probably the most illustrative of this. You really get a correlation with these linear networks and the build out. And then road, which has a lot more hierarchy than those three other infrastructures. So I often say that infrastructure is kind of our default urban design, and I think this is especially true in the US as it really organizes how we build, even as these infrastructures obsolesce. Okay, so now I'm getting down to the site scale. Before I sort of get into these 400 projects that we looked at two types. One is reuse, which everybody knows and loves. It's the high lines. Maybe you tell your parents about it when you go home for Thanksgiving. Hey, that's what I do. That's what landscape architecture is. I often hear that. Here we're looking at a project by Aspect Studios in Australia and also repurposing a rail line. But there's also another type of project that I don't think gets enough attention, and we call it a co-use project. This is where part of that transportation corridor is repurposed. Often it's a multimodal situation, sometimes not. It's just the street wasn't right sized to begin with, or there's pressure to sort of reprogram that, whether it's any four infrastructures, but you're looking at a street in El Paso here. This is one of our projects. To get a really big overview of what this site scale is, like what are infrastructure adaptation projects in practice, like what are we working on? We looked at these four infrastructures, we looked at 400 projects, a quarter were our projects, half in the States, half out of the States, with some criteria attached. And we found that they were about 2 miles in length. Okay, interesting. That's about the extent of the project. That's kind of the budget limitation, let's say. Or we could hypothesize that that's what it is. Oops. They're mostly permanent. We also looked at these temporary projects, ones that are intended to come down, like that experimental plaza in New York, or if you remember the one with the highway with the colorful mosaics, that's came down as well. And then we found about a third of these are co-use projects. Most are reuse projects. And then we found, quite a neat kind of map of the infrastructures that were obsolete or becoming less relevant. So the most reuse was in the port infrastructure, and the least was in road. Okay. So we took that, interesting for that set of 400. We learned some things about what's happening in the US and outside. And then we took a smaller set of about 60 projects that really illustrated different strategies, different approaches to the same type of infrastructure. But we wanted some diversity in that set. We found that there's, basically 5 ways, let's say really basic ways that you can do this. And that's just their location and section. So if we're looking at an elevated rail, there's 5 ways that you can work with that infrastructure. So in the actual roadbed, this is the high line. You're taking it, you're putting landscape in there, you're putting public space in there, you're putting people in there. Under, this is the Bentway in Toronto. So basically using either active or disused infrastructure, but as a roof. Above, if you can see that kind of bridge over to the right side there. Ooh, some interesting screen buzz. So that, the bridge is kind of using the infrastructure, bridging over it, but elevated in some way. Along, which is quite common, it's using land that is part of the parcel but might not be exactly entangled with the infrastructure. And then on, which is how we classify most of the infrastructure projects. So you can see all the way over to the right here, you have basically, I'll call it tactical interventions, things that are meant to be removable. So think parking day, think things that are on the street, your sidewalk cafes, your COVID sheds, unfortunate COVID sheds. And then this can sort of map onto the other infrastructures here with port, river, rail again, or sorry, this is actually road and then rail. Sorry, road. Rail, road, my bad. Okay, then we took that set in half and did case studies of about 30 projects. And this is where it gets messier. We looked at basically who was the catalyst in each of these projects, why was it happening, how did it happen, what was the outcome, what did it affect afterwards. What were the benefits? We tried to classify in general out of that set of 30. What were those benefits? We found, some of these things. I would say one of the more interesting things is that when you start to reuse, especially rail and road infrastructure, it has similar carbon impacts as adaptive reuse. So if you think of adaptive reuse for buildings, you're taking material that is already brought to the site, has a lower carbon footprint. That argument has not been made for infrastructure that I've found, but I think it's an important one. And then we tried to map how these projects were funded. Super bizarre. You might think that because these projects were built with public funding, often federal funding, that went towards engineering projects, or at the state level or at the city level, they would be funded by public funds to convert them, but that's not the case. You have a sort of gradient from public to private here, mapped onto each infrastructure type. I'll come back to this. We also extrapolated from that group of 30 what were the general phases of infrastructure adaptation projects. So how did these things get built? Were they generated by community groups? Were they generated top-down, bottom-up? Where did they come from? How long did they take to do, design or get realized? And a lot of this is drawn from our work with the Highline Network, which basically attempts to learn from the process of the Highline development and the kind of unintended explosive development that came after, to basically look at, disseminate those learnings to other projects around the country. Okay, so wrapping up here. So we've been sort of getting down in scale a little bit. And, I think in general, part of this project is to call attention to this project type. We tend to think about infrastructure adaptation as one type, like, oh, I'm working on a waterfront, I'm working on a riverfront, I'm working on an elevated rail, or I'm working on a complete street. Part of this project is trying to bring those together into conversation a little bit more, because it does represent a good chunk of projects that landscape architects work on. Also architects, especially in other countries, but it's something that we see our discipline leading a lot more. But also it's, and it's an argument for why do this, right? I mean, there aren't a lot of arguments for why convert a waterfront. Like, it's pretty, it's beautiful, it makes a great public space. But there are functional reasons why you would actually privilege linear infrastructure over another project type, let's say a parcel development. Okay, the third reason, I think, is because, and this should be an argument that's familiar, but we want to move beyond these kind of single-use landscapes, whether they're industrial, but we're talking about, this is in Houston here, these places that are meant for speed, they're meant for a single use, here shipping, and they're meant to go fast. Often funded by federal dollars. So this is, the idea is ships need to get in and out as fast as possible. The Army Corps, also in Houston, lined a bunch of bayous, which is a slow-moving stream in Houston, in order to get water out fast, right? We just need to get it out as fast as possible. Again, also federally funded. But they make spaces that look like this. This is Buffalo Bayou before my firm started working on it. Completely scoured, uninhabitable in terms of human life, and you could say animal and plant life as well. Very single use. But there's a lot of reasons why you would want to make this multifunctional. And the irony here is that these projects tend to be built by federal dollars, but this project was built almost entirely by philanthropic dollars. And I think that that's part of the argument that I want to make, is that we really want to be thinking about that relationship. Why are we kind of a little bit backwards in how they're funded? If we're talking about the public good, we should be putting public money into it. If we're talking about moving goods, we can also make it a place for people. And I would also argue that sometimes, these single-use spaces don't actually function in the most efficient way. One unique feature, especially of Buffalo Bayou here, is that it actually has an enhancement in terms of how it deals with flooding. So this is Hurricane Harvey. This is part of the study I mentioned earlier. But we discovered that part of the way the design team looked at the channel, and this was, again, a lot of negotiation with the Army Corps of Engineers about the channel design, but part of it was to have these benches. I wish I had a pointer. Okay. So these benches here are essentially meant to give space to water and drop sediment. So if you remember that super muddy image that I showed earlier, it looks like a complete disaster and the park is completely suffocated, but that's actually the design intent. It's to actually take the sediment out of the water, slow the water down so that it can drop the sediment before absolutely, making a beeline down the channel. So I would say that, sometimes this has a better function in terms of thinking about ways that you might want to just not design for the fastest possible or most efficient possible outcome. I talked about funding earlier. I think we're seeing this a little bit more. I'm encouraged by this. So I talked about Buffalo Bayou, but there's also a kind of outgrowth of that called Bayou Greenways 2020, which intends to sort of bring the concept of using these channels, these bayous, which are essentially flood control, or that's how they're thought of functionally within Houston, and actually treat them as greenways. And so there's a funding relationship where the city and county are responsible for some maintenance and takes it off of the Corps' hands, and you also get philanthropic dollars that are building these very simple trail systems. So I think there's some interesting relationships there that are developing. And I do think also, sort of move on to this slide, with the IIJA and the IRA, the two federal bills that basically tackled infrastructure. A lot of that funding is super traditional, roads, bridges. But there is, I think, a growing recognition federally that there's other types of projects worth funding, and they have a public space component. This is another look at, this is the sort of map of Bayou Greenways in Houston. It's I would say in a kind of like shorthand, it's the cheapest possible build out for landscape architecture in the largest possible area. It works on all of these bayou systems. I mean, it's just vast. But the intention is that every one of these will have public access within the channel, which is pretty big. It's also pretty weird. A lot of it looks like, I'm not going to get an exact picture, but a lot of it looks like a line channel with a path in it. This is one of the more sort of scenic parts of it. But I think these relationships are interesting between infrastructure and public space. One that's not linear, that starts with, let's say, engineering and ends with a park, but ones that are a little bit more messy and reciprocal. One of the more interesting networks that's being built out is in Atlanta. I would say this also falls under the low-cost, giant scale category, which I find really interesting. The ambition here is to completely change how people get around Atlanta, which right now is 100% in cars, and to actually get them out of their cars and circulating around the city and reconnect different parts. This is an interesting project, I'll say, because it has a lot of federal funding through hook and crook and all sorts of things. Basically, senators, representatives came to actually deliver money to the city here, which is sort of an interesting precedent. Here we have Sydney, again, totally different funding structure, but converting their industrial harbor into public space and making it a tourist attraction. Copenhagen, they built out on their road network a complete cycle network. And again, we don't have 60% of people commuting by bike in the US. We don't have any city that's even close to that. But this is kind of an example of what that network looks like when it's blown up to a city scale. So on there, and I think, part of what I just want to argue for in general, I think, is just this relationship between what is a public work and what is a public benefit, and how can we understand public space as part of that and incorporated with the functional and also these other benefits that haven't been thought about. Thank you very much. So I hope you've thought of questions. And by the way, thank you for coming down from the last row there, those people who were so game in moving. Yeah, happy to take any questions about practice-based research, about the projects that I showed early, or about infrastructure.
So, thank you for the lecture. I think it's a really interesting topic. And I guess the question is really about infrastructure. You're focused on transportation infrastructure right now. There's a lot of public infrastructure that isn't transportation related, but which also has the same set of features, right? It's reaching obsolescence, it's extremely obdurate, it gives us a lot of perfect form. Does the project expand eventually, or?
I mean, you might detect that it's been tough to contain it right now. That's actually been the real trick. I feel like I'm always, doing this kind of motion. But yes, I think, there's some really interesting folks. Like I think of the, what is it called? The something Greenway outside of Toronto, where they're taking electrical corridors and basically, making a greenway out of it. Different spatial challenges, different conditions, because overhead power lines are just like a completely, it's just different. But yeah, the same form. We had to exclude some things. I think there's a part of the book that acknowledges that airports are a really central part and project type that belong in relation to this, but they really have completely different spatial characteristics. I love those projects, and we're being asked to do a lot of those airfield conversions, especially overseas and for smaller, like there's just an interesting one in Santa Monica. I don't think of Santa Monica as having an airfield that needs conversion, but these are right in the middle of very dense urban spaces. So yeah, I think there's some, communication networks, even pipelines, things like that. But yeah, I guess my hope is that it will be able to be made, it'll be a bridge to the next set of infrastructures.
through this, it was really hard to get a handle on what's a real project and what's a speculation or an advocacy kind of effort in the context of a research studio. At the same time, I'm curious what the trajectory of that feels like to you, because I look at a lot of these projects and they feel like ones that, boy, if we put it all together, that would be great, but it's going to take, a century's worth of political will or all the money we have.
Yeah.
And so when I think about getting to a tipping point, like, is the research that the studio is doing being seen as still just speculative that can inform what you're doing in other kind of prompted contexts? Are you being approached by municipalities and other groups? Where are we in the curve of that lifespan?
Yeah, I like how you assume that it's going somewhere and having a life that's linear.
Or is it that dead end? I didn't ask that.
No, yeah. No, I mean, I think it's maybe that like choppy seas is a better metaphor than like a curve, but for us in the studios, in practice with our clients, we're always working on precedent. And so I think, and I've seen, if we are able to come up with precedents that say, oh, well, this city's done it, it becomes infinitely more easy for them to imagine what that is. I can't tell you like the numbers of like Japanese delegates that come to the Bay Area just to like tour around projects. I mean, it's one of these sort of bizarre things, but it's, I guess it's just how our brains work with spending money. It's like we need to see that it's done. And I should say that the 30 case studies, or the group of 60 really draws from all over the world, because there's projects that we do in China, there's projects in Nordic countries that we don't have that scale, that scope, that let's say commitment to spending for finish. Like a lot of the work that I showed in Houston or referenced in Atlanta, I would call them like low finish, high function. The idea that you spend money now to make a thing and it'll kind of get filled out later, or that's the hope. And so, yeah, I think part of it is advocating for the possible, saying that, oh, you have a rail project, here's what you can do with that, here's 10 examples of what that is. And some of that we're already doing in the studios. You're Googling, over here. We know some of these precedents already. Some of them are very well known. The Highland was built 15 years ago. But yeah, I think it's increasingly clear to me that this is becoming like a disciplinary or field project. I would say a disciplinary project. It's maybe outside the scope of practice strictly, but it has benefits for it. Hope that helps. Other questions? Oh, double. You guys are in sync. Paula, yeah.
Yeah, SWA is a large company, right, with a long history, right? So you really have this incredible, deep knowledge of all these projects across the geography of the United States and abroad, right? And to consider these projects as a research, right, almost as a retroactive analysis of what you've actually been doing, and then comparing these projects together, I find it incredibly inspiring, right? I would have loved to hear way more about the financial, where money comes from for this project, because you have, the company has knowledge of that, right? And to really lay that out. I'm sure that this is not a subject that we often talk about in education, right?
Yeah.
And it's especially because you have, like, in your pocket so many projects historically that could lead to incredibly rich data set.
Yeah, and this is something I think I became aware of in the early days of having the lab, is you are privileged to essentially it's it's not a private data set, but it is something that is not easily extracted from any firm. If I was sitting in your seat and I approach a firm and say, hey, I'd love to interview you on this subject, or I'd love to know more about this project and this project, again, it's like you really might not get the depth of information, the history in just the folders. You know, a lot of, I'm just like buzzing around in folders trying to figure out different correspondence, how these things are, you know, and partially it's interviews, partially it's seeing these projects built, what those timelines are, waiting.
And I mean, it also speaks to the unseen, right? It speaks to the invisible aspect of landscape architecture. We are used to seeing, you know, the ultimate effect, the road to get to that point. I think that, I mean, who are stakeholders in all
Yeah.
these projects, right? Who were the key people to really make something happen? What is the community? I think these are incredibly interesting
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, and I think eventually when the case studies are published, it's interesting to see the diversity, because sometimes and even I think this is like, oh, these are all bottom-up kind of projects where the community came together and they wanted to, for instance, like Great Highway in San Francisco, there's this kind of surge to convert or make permanent this pandemic intervention where they essentially decommissioned part of a road that was next to Ocean Beach, so far on the Pacific side, and turned it into a promenade. It's beautiful. It's great. It's a road. It's industrial looking. It's, you know, not meant to be like the Champs-Elysees, but it was, people love it. And the community was like, no, we need to keep this. I think they scheduled it, you probably know better, but it's like they scheduled it to be off limits to cars on Saturday, Sunday, and starting at Friday at 6 or something like that. So it was a timed kind of thing. And people saw it in the pandemic, they wanted to make it permanent. And there are those kinds of projects that, you know, conceptually are easy to understand. You want to make public space in your neighborhood, you're committed to it, you see it, you love it. And then there's like straight top-down projects. In Atlanta, there's also an incredibly ambitious deck project called The Stitch, which is taking like 5 blocks that span, I think it's something like a 10-lane highway, and decking the entire space. I mean, it's just massive, and that is 100% top-down. It's like, we want to revitalize the downtown, here's how we do it. We do it with a deck park, we're going for it. And so I think that that's the stuff that I'm interested in, like how do these get built, how do these happen? They're very different. I wish there was a way to kind of generalize, which is what that phasing was about, trying to generalize how these things might get built. But man, there's a lot of different catalysts, so many different catalysts. The project in Houston that was temporary was because the convention center authority wanted to make a kind of welcoming billboard gate art project to the Super Bowl. They completely missed the Super Bowl deadline. It's like 6 months late. And then it stayed up, and now it's informing design for a DOT project that's basically reconfiguring like all the toll system in the highway in Houston. So that's the stuff that's like, I mean, I nerd out on that too. It's like, how do we work on the end stage of a project, but how do we work upstream? How do we even know what's happening upstream? That's what I think is empowering for us.
I really like that you kind of pulled back the curtain and sort of talked about some of the efforts in the office and where they started and stopped, and some things that maybe didn't work out, or were abandoned or recalibrated. I'm just wondering, like 8 or 9 years in, if this mission is tracked where you thought you would go, and if there was a moment where it sort of was recalibrated, or are you kind of surprised where you ended up, or is this sort of in your mind where you thought this project would go?
Yeah, I would say we're in a moment of recalibration right now. We're doing this big effort again, I said like every 3 years we kind of revisit what we need and take temperature, you could say. And the project began to say, like, what's our next applied research project? There's a lot of stuff in the pipeline, you know, that me and my colleague have, but like, let's think about this together. And we workshopped it. And this is very active right now. We're going to be discussing this next Thursday and next Monday. But what seems to be trickling out of that process is that it's not that we need more research or more projects, is we need a better way to share the information and to actually like embed it in our projects. And that might be education, that might be a database, that might be, you know, training, that might be workshops, that might be somebody in the office basically sort of, you know, doing what we'd call tech transfer, like, you know, getting it from the research into the project. That was not expected. I didn't think we'd be there. Another thing is we're like weirdly in a publishing moment. There's like 3 things that are kind of in the works for publishing, which is not exactly where I want to be right now. I don't mind it. It's just like, as many of you know, like very long and cumbersome. So it does not align with practice very well. But again, we want to share these things and we want to share them more widely. So sometimes that, and we just, you know, we get asked to do that. So not a bad thing. Okay, next question. Yeah?
Thank you very much. A very self-serving question.
Yeah.
When you look at the project where you saw that maybe it was actually not very good
Yeah.
in terms of carbon footprint, do you ever look at trees coming from nurseries and the efficiency of the carbon footprint of, you know, shipping liners from Oregon, a nursery in Ohio, and then sending it to a project that will use many transplants?
Yeah, this is, I think, yeah, this is a very timely question. It's becoming clear to us. Chris Hardy at Sasaki has done a good amount of thinking about this, you know, without a huge amount of conclusions, but I think it's something that's becoming present to us. Like, architects have thought about materials and how we track and do LCAs and how we might, you know, understand the carbon footprint of different assemblies. But like nobody has done anything on plant material, which is our, like, it's a lot of our materials, or soil. Olin Labs, their practice-based research group, has done some development of manufactured soils. So they've like touched on it, but very much from a kind of like recycling standpoint, not so much from carbon, let's say. But yeah, this is something that I think is huge for our discipline because especially mature trees, you're shipping them, like you say, from Oregon. We're lucky to have offices in California, so a lot of the stuff that comes from Oregon is not that far, but it's still, you know, for a large tree, a huge amount. And then there's all of the carbon that goes into the growing part. We have not found a good partner in the nursery trade to even start that project with. I will say that one outgrowth, this goes kind of back to your question, is the firm recently developed a climate action plan which deals with our project carbon emissions and is now in the process of standing up a whole group that's going to be calculating carbon emissions across all our projects. So what you saw in the Dallas project basically will be for every project, regardless of client will. So I think in the next 2 years, we'll probably have a better handle on that, but I really have not seen anything. I mean, it's depressing that over a tree's lifetime, we might actually be, you know, it might be not climate positive or carbon negative. It might not be sequestering. And on that project, actually, one thing in terms of trees is it preserved a mature stand of trees, and that's actually what got a lot of our total carbon budget much, you could say, reduced. So preservation of trees, we realized, was extremely important, and not to grade, you know, not to rip the site out, grade, and then put trees in. I mean, when you see the numbers, it's just very clear, like, oh, that's not a small move, that's a huge move, carbon-wise. So yeah, I think that's a huge space for research and collaboration. Other questions? I don't hear many student questions. One or two? One? Okay, there we go.
Thank you for your talk. I think it's also for sharing like all your info, the QR codes,
Oh, yeah.
the booklet. That's really helpful. I was going to ask, have you heard from communities or people that you may not work directly with that they've been able to use some of your products?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that's part of what I regret about how we're structured is we're very one way. Like, we see a gap or a place where we want to be working, we produce research to answer a question, we put it out there, and I always call it a self-serve model. We are a one-way street in some respects. We really don't get a lot of feedback or good feedback about how it's being used. A lot of it is anecdotal. 2 years later, somebody would be like, oh yeah, I used this on this project, and it really informed the whole, there was a project that the New York office did. They're like, oh yeah, we completely redid this, the way that people, the way that we designed the plaza so that people could interact better with the features. And I was like, okay, oh, great. Sometimes, because we built the fire research at the same time as some of these projects, there was one in the Santa Monica Mountains for the National Park Service. There's a resort up in Napa County, another one in Lake County, and a large development in Southern California. So we were able to kind of, it's a little bit messier than maybe a traditional research process, but have a kind of informed back and forth with those. What are you learning? What are you asking for? Oh, this is what we need to provide. Which might have been more of a traditional consulting kind of, oh, okay, so we acquired this information. We're the consultants on this project just for fire. But yeah, that's kind of part of my regrets is it's a real one-way street. I'll find out somebody used the climate infrastructure cards for outreach. I'm like, oh, great. I'm glad it was helpful, and people loved it. So I would say that is really tough, and that's a place where I would like to improve, just because it's really useful. Knowing how it's used. I mean, that's part of the difference between academic research and research and practice. I think is that you actually have the ability to take what you've built and put it into something. But because we are such a big firm, we have 40 principals, we have 250-ish people, 8 offices. It's it's not the kind of thing where you go over to somebody's desk and say oh, check this out. So that's one of the things I'd like to be better on. Last question? If we're at last question? Yeah? Yes.
I'm just curious about how you, what's your test run for simulation models and how do you run them? And it seems very tied to past project researchers. And I'm curious how maybe virtual results, how they overlap.
You're talking about the kind of Viz Sim area, or yeah, it's interesting. When we sort of set out to develop the structure of the lab, Viz Sim was one of the categories that we thought it's just a very easy R&D kind of slot to put things in. Okay, we have this software. Let's see if we can adapt it for landscape architecture. It's meant for environmental performance for architects, but let's see if we can tweak it, get it out of BIM, get it into BIM. Let's see if we can, mess with this to make it applicable to us. I think it's just been the spread of expertise in the group. There hasn't been a lot of technologically savvy or interested folks to take that on, because it really is like sometimes a very specialized skill set to be able to just want to mess with software and models and simulation. So I have the opportunity to hire somebody in this next year or so, and so I think that's something that we are looking at. Personally, I'm kind of the through line for the past 8 years, but we've had 2 folks that have cycled in and out of the group, and so this third person that comes in will bring something totally different. So that might be part of it. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being such a generous audience and having questions, and I look forward to seeing all of you. And I should say, we have one OSU grad at SWA, and she would love to talk to any of you if you're looking for co-op or post-grad or whatever. So, I'll share her information if you want. Thanks.